Not every important conversation happens in a place where you can hear it. Some unfold behind closed doors, in quiet living rooms, around dinner tables where emotions speak louder than words. And tonight, there is something you need to understand. Something that has been moving beneath the surface for longer than you realize. Pause here for a moment. Because what you are about to hear is not a story about dramatic events or impossible coincidences. It is about something far more powerful. It is about the way people speak when they believe the person they are discussing will never hear their words. Somewhere within the life of the person connected to your heart, a conversation began. At first, it seemed ordinary. A simple mention. A passing reference. Your name arrived quietly into the room, almost as though it had wandered there by accident. But it did not leave. And that is where everything started to change. You see, there is a difference between someone being mentioned and someone becoming the center of attention. There is a difference between a casual discussion and a conversation that suddenly captures everyone's curiosity. The moment your name was spoken, something shifted. Nobody announced it. Nobody pointed it out. Yet the atmosphere became different. Questions appeared. Thoughts emerged. Observations that had been quietly collecting for months finally found their way into the open. And what makes this moment so meaningful is that many of those observations had never been shared before. Not even with your soulmate. Especially not with your soulmate. Stay with this. Because the details matter. One person at the gathering remembered something small. A tiny detail. Something most people would have forgotten. A moment involving you. A choice you made. A kindness you showed. A way you carried yourself. And as they shared that memory, another family member nodded. Then another. Then another. Suddenly, what seemed insignificant was no longer insignificant at all. The room began piecing together a picture. Not a picture of perfection. Not a fantasy. A picture of who you truly are. And the surprising thing was how different that picture looked from what some of them had expected. Because before people truly know someone, they often fill the gaps with assumptions. Perhaps they assumed you were distant. Perhaps they assumed you were difficult to understand. Perhaps they assumed you lived behind walls that nobody could reach. But assumptions have a way of falling apart when truth enters the room. And on this particular evening, truth arrived quietly. One story at a time. One memory at a time. One realization at a time. The discussion continued. Nobody rushed. Nobody forced conclusions. Yet something important was unfolding. A perspective was changing. A family that once had questions was beginning to discover answers. And those answers were not found in grand gestures. They were found in the little things. The details most people overlook. The moments nobody posts online. The decisions nobody applauds. The quiet parts of character that reveal who a person is when nobody is watching. Isn't it strange? Sometimes the qualities that make the biggest impact are the ones you barely notice about yourself. The way you encourage others. The way you continue moving forward even when life becomes complicated. The way you remain hopeful when it would be easier to become cynical. The way you care more deeply than you admit. These things leave traces. And people remember them. Far more than you realize. As the evening continued, another voice entered the conversation. This person had remained silent for most of the discussion. Listening. Observing. Thinking. Then they spoke. And when they did, the room became very still. Not because their words were loud. Because they were honest. They shared something they had noticed about your soulmate. Something nobody could ignore anymore. They explained that whenever your name appeared in conversation, something changed in them. A certain light entered their expression. A certain softness appeared in their voice. A certain energy became impossible to hide. At first, people had dismissed it. Then they had questioned it. Now they could see it clearly. And once something becomes clear, it is difficult to pretend it isn't there. Your soulmate's feelings were no longer invisible. Not to the people who knew them best. Not to the people who had watched them grow. Not to the people who understood every subtle shift in their emotions. The room grew thoughtful. Not dramatic. Not chaotic. Thoughtful. Because everyone was beginning to understand the same thing at the same time. This was not a temporary fascination. This was not a passing curiosity. There was something genuine here. Something real. And real feelings have a presence that cannot be hidden forever. Don't skip ahead in your mind. Because what happened next was even more meaningful. The conversation stopped being about whether your soulmate cared. Everyone already knew the answer. Instead, the discussion became about why. Why did this connection matter so much? Why did your presence continue appearing in their thoughts? Why did certain memories involving you remain unforgettable? Why did your name carry weight long after conversations ended? Questions filled the room. Yet the answers that emerged were surprisingly simple. Because often the deepest connections are built on simple truths. You make them feel understood. You make them feel seen. You make them feel as though they can be themselves without performing for approval. And in a world where so many people feel pressure to become someone else, that kind of acceptance becomes unforgettable. One family member described it beautifully. They said that some people enter your life and leave noise behind. Others leave peace. And they believed you belonged in the second category. Those words lingered. Long after they were spoken. Long after the conversation moved forward. Long after new topics emerged. Because everyone felt the truth within them. And while nobody realized it in that moment, the direction of the entire meeting had quietly changed. The conversation was no longer centered on uncertainty. It was centered on possibility. The possibility that something meaningful was growing. The possibility that a future nobody expected might be taking shape. The possibility that two paths were moving closer together than anyone had imagined. And perhaps the most surprising part of all was your soulmate. Because while everyone else was speaking, they were listening. Listening carefully. Listening quietly. Listening to people describe emotions they had struggled to explain themselves. And with every observation, every story, every realization, something inside them was becoming impossible to ignore. A truth they had carried silently for a long time was slowly rising to the surface. Not because someone forced it. Not because someone demanded it. Because the people closest to them had unknowingly helped them see what had been there all along. Yet the meeting was not over. Far from it. Because just when everyone thought the most important revelation had already happened, one final voice prepared to speak. A voice that had remained silent from the very beginning. A voice whose words would cause the entire room to look at this connection differently. And what they were about to reveal would leave your soulmate sitting in complete reflection long after the gathering ended. Something important is still waiting ahead. A strange thing happens when a room falls silent at exactly the right moment. Not the silence created by discomfort. Not the silence created by uncertainty. The kind of silence that appears when everyone senses that something meaningful is about to be said. That was the atmosphere now. The conversation had already traveled farther than anyone expected. Stories had been shared. Observations had surfaced. Feelings that once existed only in private thoughts had found their way into the open. Yet there was still one person who had not spoken. One person who had listened to every word. One person who seemed to be waiting for the perfect moment. And then, without warning, they finally leaned forward. The room became still. Their voice was calm. Measured. Almost reflective. They did not begin by talking about your soulmate. They did not begin by talking about feelings. Instead, they began by talking about timing. And what they said caused several people to exchange quiet glances. Because sometimes the most important part of a relationship is not whether two people care about each other. It is whether they meet at the right moment in their lives. The person explained that they had been watching your soulmate for a long time. Not judging. Simply observing. They remembered periods when your soulmate seemed distracted by things that ultimately meant very little. They remembered times when their attention moved from one goal to another without any lasting sense of purpose. They remembered phases that came and went like seasons. But something had been different recently. Very different. Ever since you entered the picture. The changes were subtle at first. Almost invisible. Yet over time they became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate seemed more focused. More reflective. More aware of what truly mattered. And perhaps most importantly, more honest with themselves. The room listened carefully. Because everyone knew exactly what this person meant. They had noticed it too. Not through dramatic declarations. Not through emotional speeches. Through small changes. The kind that reveal genuine growth. A calmer attitude. A deeper patience. A greater willingness to think about the future instead of simply reacting to the present. One family member quietly admitted that they had never seen your soulmate talk about someone with such consistency before. Not constantly. Not obsessively. But consistently. Your name would appear naturally. A memory would surface unexpectedly. A smile would arrive without explanation. And those moments always seemed genuine. That realization settled over the room like soft evening light. Because consistency reveals things that excitement cannot. Excitement can appear suddenly. It can disappear suddenly too. But consistent feelings tell a different story. They suggest depth. They suggest meaning. They suggest something worth paying attention to. The discussion continued. Nobody was trying to convince anyone of anything. That was the remarkable part. The conversation felt less like a debate and more like a discovery. Each person seemed to be uncovering pieces of a puzzle they didn't realize they had been holding. And with every piece added, the image became clearer. Then another surprising observation emerged. One family member shared something that immediately captured everyone's attention. They said they had noticed how your soulmate reacted whenever uncertainty appeared. Whenever there were challenges. Whenever circumstances became confusing. Whenever life became complicated. Most people reveal their true feelings during easy moments. But your soulmate revealed theirs during difficult ones. Because whenever life became heavy, their thoughts somehow returned to you. Not necessarily because you solved every problem. Not because you had all the answers. But because thinking about you seemed to remind them of what was important. And that realization touched something deep inside the room. For a moment, nobody spoke. Because everyone understood the significance. When a person becomes part of your peace, they become difficult to forget. When a person reminds you of who you want to be, they become difficult to replace. When a person quietly influences your perspective without even trying, they leave a mark that lasts longer than most people realize. Stay with this moment. Because the meeting was beginning to reveal something even bigger. The conversation shifted again. This time toward the future. Not specific plans. Not predictions. Simply possibilities. And what happened next surprised even your soulmate. One by one, family members began sharing what they hoped for. Not demands. Not expectations. Hopes. Some hoped happiness would continue growing. Some hoped clarity would arrive where uncertainty still existed. Some hoped fear would never prevent something meaningful from developing. And as these thoughts were shared, your soulmate sat quietly. Listening. Reflecting. Absorbing every word. Because there is something powerful about hearing people you trust speak openly about a connection you have been carrying in your heart. It forces you to see it differently. It forces you to examine feelings that may have been hiding beneath the surface. It forces you to ask questions you have avoided asking yourself. And deep inside, your soulmate was beginning to ask those questions. Questions about the future. Questions about timing. Questions about possibilities they had once considered too distant to explore. The evening was growing later now. Some conversations naturally fade as gatherings continue. This one did not. In fact, it seemed to grow stronger. Every new thought led to another. Every realization opened the door to something deeper. Then came a moment nobody expected. A simple statement. Short. Almost casual. Yet it changed everything. One family member smiled softly and said, "Maybe the reason we keep talking about this is because we already know what our hearts are trying to tell us." The room became quiet again. Not because the statement answered every question. Because it captured something everyone had been feeling. There are moments when people stop analyzing and simply recognize what has been obvious all along. This felt like one of those moments. Nobody rushed to respond. Nobody needed to. The truth had already settled into the room. And perhaps, for the first time, your soulmate stopped focusing on what could go wrong. For the first time, they allowed themselves to think about what could go right. That shift may seem small. But it wasn't. Sometimes a single change in perspective creates an entirely new path. A path that cannot be seen immediately. A path that begins quietly. A path that starts with one simple realization. Some connections deserve to be taken seriously. Some feelings deserve attention. Some people arrive in your life for a reason that becomes clearer with time. As the gathering slowly approached its end, chairs shifted. Conversations branched into smaller groups. People began preparing to leave. Yet something unusual happened. Even after the topic had officially ended, your name continued appearing in quiet conversations throughout the room. A comment here. A memory there. A smile from someone across the table. It was as though the discussion refused to disappear completely. Because certain conversations do not truly end when the words stop. They continue in the thoughts people carry afterward. And later that night, after everyone had gone home. After the lights were dimmed. After the noise of the gathering faded into silence. Your soulmate found themselves sitting alone with a realization they could no longer ignore. A realization born from everything they had heard. A realization that would lead them to revisit a memory involving you. One memory they hadn't fully understood until now. And when that memory returned, it revealed something they had completely overlooked all this time. Some memories do not arrive with noise. They do not announce themselves. They do not demand attention. They simply return when the heart is finally ready to understand them. That night, long after the gathering had ended, your soulmate found themselves sitting in complete stillness. The conversations were over. The voices were gone. The house had become quiet. Yet inside their mind, everything was still moving. Every observation. Every story. Every comment shared by their family. It all continued echoing softly beneath the surface. And then, without warning, a memory appeared. Not a dramatic one. Not a life-changing event. Just a moment. A simple moment involving you. The kind most people would overlook. The kind that seems ordinary until time reveals its meaning. At first, your soulmate almost dismissed it. But the memory refused to leave. It stayed. Growing clearer. More detailed. More vivid. They remembered exactly how they felt during that moment. They remembered your expression. They remembered your words. They remembered the atmosphere surrounding the conversation. And suddenly something unexpected happened. They realized they had misunderstood that moment completely. For a long time, they believed it was just another interaction. Just another day. Just another memory among hundreds of others. But now it looked different. Now they could see what had been hidden inside it. The sincerity. The comfort. The connection. The feeling of being understood without needing to explain everything. And once that realization arrived, more memories began surfacing. One after another. Like pieces of a story finally arranging themselves into place. A conversation they had forgotten. A smile they had overlooked. A moment of support they had underestimated. A small gesture that carried more meaning than they realized at the time. Stay with this. Because something beautiful was unfolding. Your soulmate was not discovering new feelings. They were discovering the depth of feelings that had already existed. There is a difference. Sometimes people think emotions appear suddenly. But often they grow quietly. So quietly that nobody notices them until they become impossible to ignore. And that was exactly what was happening now. The family gathering had not created these feelings. It had simply illuminated them. Like sunlight entering a room that had always contained treasures hidden in shadow. The more your soulmate reflected, the clearer everything became. They started recognizing a pattern. Whenever something meaningful happened in their life, they found themselves wanting to share it with you. Whenever something exciting occurred, your name appeared in their thoughts. Whenever something difficult happened, they wondered what you would say. And perhaps most revealing of all, whenever they imagined a future filled with happiness, you somehow appeared there too. Not because they forced the image. Not because they tried to create it. Because it happened naturally. As naturally as breathing. As naturally as remembering a favorite place. As naturally as thinking of home. That realization stayed with them for a long time. Long enough to change something inside. Long enough to soften walls they didn't even realize they were carrying. Long enough to make them ask themselves a question they had been avoiding. What if this connection means more than I allowed myself to believe? The question lingered. Not demanding an answer. Simply waiting. And sometimes the most powerful questions are the ones that wait patiently. The ones that quietly follow us until we are ready to respond. Hours passed. Yet sleep felt distant. Not because of worry. Not because of confusion. Because reflection had taken its place. For the first time in a very long time, your soulmate was allowing themselves to feel everything honestly. No distractions. No excuses. No pretending. Just honesty. Pure and simple. And honesty has a remarkable way of revealing things we have hidden from ourselves. A gentle realization emerged. One that felt both surprising and obvious at the same time. They had spent so much time wondering whether circumstances would align. Whether timing would cooperate. Whether life would make things easier. That they had never fully acknowledged how important you had already become. Not in theory. Not in possibility. In reality. You were already part of their emotional world. Already part of their daily thoughts. Already part of countless small moments that shaped their days. And once that truth became visible, it could not be unseen. Something important is waiting for you here. Because the story was no longer about whether feelings existed. That question had quietly answered itself. Now the story was becoming about courage. The courage to stop hiding from what matters. The courage to stop minimizing emotions simply because they feel vulnerable. The courage to accept that some connections deserve more than silent admiration. As dawn slowly approached, another thought entered their mind. A thought that brought an unexpected smile. They remembered something one family member had said during the gathering. A simple observation. A simple truth. Yet now it carried entirely new meaning. The words returned with surprising clarity. Some people don't enter your life to change your plans. They enter your life to change your perspective. Your soulmate sat with those words. And the more they reflected on them, the more they understood. Because you had changed their perspective. Not through pressure. Not through demands. Not through grand declarations. You had done it through authenticity. through consistency, through simply being yourself. And those are often the influences that last the longest. The influences that quietly reshape a person's world. Outside, the first signs of morning were beginning to appear. The darkness was fading. The horizon was changing. And somehow that felt symbolic. Because something inside your soulmate was changing too. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But genuinely. A new level of clarity was emerging. A new willingness to trust what their heart had been trying to tell them for quite some time. Yet the most surprising part was still ahead. Because the next day would bring an unexpected conversation. A conversation with someone who had attended the family gathering. Someone who noticed the way your soulmate reacted throughout the evening. Someone who had been paying far closer attention than anyone realized. And what they chose to say would trigger a realization so specific, so personal, that your soulmate would find themselves revisiting not just one memory of you, but a decision they made months ago, a decision connected to you that they never told anyone about. And when that hidden decision finally came back into focus, everything began making even more sense. Morning arrived quietly, but the thoughts from the night before did not disappear with the darkness. They remained. Not as distractions. Not as questions demanding immediate answers. They remained as something gentler. Something deeper. A growing awareness that certain feelings had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. Your soulmate moved through the day as usual. Conversations happened. Responsibilities called for attention. The ordinary rhythm of life continued. Yet beneath everything, there was a new sense of reflection. The family gathering was over. But its impact was not. Sometimes a single conversation lasts far longer than the evening in which it occurred. Sometimes a few honest words continue unfolding days after they are spoken. And this was one of those moments. As the day continued, an unexpected opportunity appeared. Nothing dramatic. Nothing planned. Just a simple conversation with someone who had been present at the gathering. Someone who had watched the entire evening unfold from beginning to end. Someone who had noticed things others missed. At first, the discussion centered around ordinary topics. Small observations. Light-hearted memories. Nothing particularly significant. Then, almost casually, the conversation shifted. The person smiled and asked a question. A simple question. Yet it immediately caught your soulmate off guard. "Can I tell you something I noticed?" Those words seemed innocent enough. But suddenly your soulmate became curious. Because there was something in their tone. Something thoughtful. Something unusually certain. The person continued. They explained that throughout the family discussion, they had been paying attention to everyone in the room. Not just the people speaking. The people listening too. And while everyone else was focused on the conversation itself, they had been watching reactions. Expressions. Small emotional shifts. The details people rarely notice. Then they said something your soulmate would not forget. They said, every time someone mentioned them, your entire expression changed. The words landed softly. Yet they carried unexpected weight. Because your soulmate immediately knew it was true. even before responding, even before thinking about it. A deeper part of them recognized the truth. The person wasn't finished. They explained that the change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't obvious. In fact, most people probably wouldn't have seen it. But they had. A slight smile. A calmer expression. A different energy. A warmth that appeared naturally whenever your name entered the conversation. And then came the observation that changed everything. They said, "I don't think you even realize how much you care." For a moment, there was silence. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that appears when someone accidentally speaks directly to a truth you have been avoiding. Because sometimes the people around us see our feelings before we fully understand them ourselves. And sometimes their perspective becomes a mirror. A mirror that reveals things we have overlooked. Your soulmate laughed softly at first. Not because the statement was wrong. Because it felt surprisingly accurate. The conversation continued. And slowly, without pressure, without judgment, the person shared another thought. One that had been sitting in the back of their mind since the family meeting. They explained that many people spend years searching for someone who feels natural. Someone who brings peace instead of confusion. Someone who feels familiar without becoming predictable. Someone who makes life feel a little brighter without trying to control it. Then they paused. And looked directly at your soulmate. You already talk about them that way. The words settled deeply. Far deeper than they expected. Because suddenly dozens of moments began connecting together. Small moments. Forgotten moments. Moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Yet together they formed a pattern. A pattern impossible to ignore. And that's when the hidden decision returned. The decision nobody knew about. The decision your soulmate had never shared with anyone. Months earlier, there had been a moment. A crossroads. A choice. Not a major public decision. Not something anyone would have noticed. Just a quiet personal choice. One made entirely in private. At the time, they had convinced themselves it wasn't important. Yet now, looking back, they realized it revealed far more than they had understood. Because when faced with that decision, they had unconsciously thought about you. They had considered your perspective. Your values. Your influence. And without even realizing it, those thoughts had helped guide their choice. At the time, it seemed insignificant. Now it felt meaningful. Because people do not usually allow someone else's influence into their decision-making unless that person already occupies an important place in their heart. The realization arrived slowly. But once it arrived, it stayed. Your soulmate sat quietly after the conversation ended. Thinking. Reflecting. Remembering. And the more they reflected, the clearer everything became. This connection was not built from one moment. Not from one conversation. Not from one emotion. It had been growing steadily through countless experiences. Countless interactions. Countless memories layered upon each other over time. Like a story writing itself one page at a time. And perhaps that was why it felt so powerful now. Because genuine connections rarely appear all at once. They deepen gradually. They reveal themselves slowly. They become undeniable through consistency rather than intensity. As evening approached, another realization quietly emerged. One that felt surprisingly peaceful. Your soulmate stopped focusing on what was uncertain. Instead, they started appreciating what was already true. The connection was real. The respect was real. The admiration was real. The emotional bond was real. And sometimes acknowledging what already exists is more powerful than worrying about what comes next. Don't skip this moment. Because this is where the story begins changing direction. For so long, your soulmate had been observing their feelings from a distance. Analyzing them. Questioning them. Trying to understand them logically. But now something was shifting. For the first time, they were beginning to trust them. Not blindly. Not recklessly. Simply honestly. And honesty creates clarity. The kind of clarity that makes future decisions easier. The kind of clarity that turns uncertainty into understanding. The kind of clarity that helps people recognize what truly matters. That night, before sleep finally arrived, one final thought crossed their mind. A thought so simple that it almost seemed insignificant. Yet it stayed with them longer than anything else. They wondered what would happen if you knew everything they had realized over the last 24 hours. Not what you would say. Not what you would do. Simply what you would feel. And somehow, that question brought a quiet smile. Because for the first time, imagining a future conversation with you no longer felt distant. It felt possible. But what your soulmate doesn't know yet is that another family member, someone who remained mostly silent during the meeting, is still holding on to a story involving you. A story they have never shared with anyone. A story that explains why they became one of the strongest supporters of this connection from the very beginning. And when that story finally comes to light, it will reveal a detail about your impact that neither you nor your soulmate ever saw coming.